It all started on a warm spring morning in Washington, D.C., when the air smelled like tension and ambition. The city was buzzing for a high-profile tech summit, an event where heads of state, billionaire CEOs, and a few controversial disruptors gathered under one roof to talk about the future of humanity. Cameras flashed like lightning as the elite poured into the massive marble hall, but no one, not even the most eagle-eyed journalists, expected the biggest moment of the summit to come not from a panel or speech, but from a single teenager standing behind his father. Elon Musk, or just X to those who knew him, was not your average 13-year-old. He had grown up in the wild, electrified world of SpaceX hangars, Tesla test tracks, and Neuralink prototypes. He wasn't sheltered. He was sharp, unusually mature, and had inherited not only his father Elon's intelligence, but also his unpredictability. So when he appeared at the summit trailing just a few feet behind Elon Musk, no one batted an eye. That was, until the confrontation. The event kicked off with all the usual pomp. Government leaders giving vaguely optimistic speeches, tech founders flexing their visions of a hyper-connected world, and billionaire panelists swapping polite praise. Elon Musk was scheduled to speak on Mars, AI, and the ethics of progress. Sitting in the front row, with a barely touched glass of sparkling water in front of him, was former U.S. President Donald Trump, invited as a surprise guest for a private roundtable that would follow the public session. His presence had already drawn tension across the room. Some guests leaned in, others leaned out, but none of them were prepared for what came next. During the break between panels, Elon and X moved backstage. Elon was calm, sipping coffee, eyes on his tablet. X was pacing, fidgeting slightly, clearly bothered by something. It wasn't until the private roundtable began, with Elon seated directly across from Trump, that the air shifted. Trump launched into a tone-deaf tirade about stupid electric cars and woke robots. He laughed loudly about how real Americans drive gas, then turned and mockingly asked Elon, "How's that Mars colony working out? Do the aliens like your taxes?" A few awkward chuckles floated through the room. Elon just smiled faintly, his usual calm demeanor masking whatever thoughts boiled beneath. But beside him, X tensed. He leaned forward slightly, his face unreadable. And then it happened. With the kind of voice only a teenager could get away with, calm, clear, but cold as steel, X said, "Maybe if you didn't ruin everything when you were in charge, we wouldn't need Mars." That alone might have drawn gasps. But he wasn't finished. Not even close. "You want to know how it's working out? Pretty well. And if you don't like it, maybe go to hell." The room froze. You could hear a pin drop on the marble. Elon didn't move. Trump's face stiffened, a flash of red creeping into his cheeks. One of the Secret Service agents subtly shifted his stance. Journalists in the room blinked as if they weren't sure they'd heard correctly. Had Elon Musk's teenage son really just told the former president of the United States to go to hell? Before anyone could say a word, Trump leaned forward, staring at X with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "What did you just say, kid?" he asked, his voice low. But X didn't flinch. He simply stared back. Elon finally looked up from his tablet, expression unreadable, and placed a calm hand on his son's shoulder. Not to scold. Almost like approval. And just like that, every phone in the room lit up. Screenshots. Live streams. Hashtags. The phrase, "Go to Hellgate," was born, and within the hour it had reached every corner of the internet. But this was only the beginning. The moment hit the news cycle like a meteor crashing into calm waters. Within 45 minutes, hashtags like #XVSTrump, #GoToHellgate, and #ElonSunsnaps were trending globally. Twitter was a battleground, Instagram was flooded with memes, and TikTokers were reenacting the scene with dramatic flair. But while the internet spiraled into chaos, the real explosion was still happening behind the closed doors of that marble-lined room in D.C. Security hadn't moved, yet. But every agent in the room had subtly shifted, their hands near earpieces, scanning faces for signs of escalation. Trump leaned back slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to decide whether he'd just been disrespected by a teenage punk or been handed the greatest political opportunity of his life. "Well," Trump said with a dry chuckle, "the future of America sure is mouthy." It was meant as a jab, a dismissal wrapped in forced humor. But the room didn't laugh. Even his usual loyalists looked unsure. One foreign diplomat muttered under his breath in French, "Ce garçon a plus de courage que la moitié de cette salle." That boy has more courage than half this room. Elon remained eerily calm. He glanced toward X, who sat back in his chair now, fingers folded, expression blank but proud. Then Elon turned to Trump and said, with the faintest trace of a smirk, "You have to admit, it takes guts." It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even a reprimand. It was, in classic Musk fashion, a challenge disguised as a compliment. Trump adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "Let me guess. Raised to believe rules don't apply, huh?" he asked, eyeing Elon. "Figures." But what Trump didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't some spoiled outburst. This had been brewing. For weeks, maybe months. Behind the scenes, X had been absorbing more than anyone realized. He had sat quietly at meetings where politicians dismissed climate change as hysteria, where billionaires laughed about space colonies while ignoring earthbound crises. He had heard the whispers that Elon was reckless, that the Musk family were dangerous idealists, that they lived in a sci-fi fantasy while the world burned. And he had stored all of it, like files in a mental hard drive, waiting for the right moment to crash the system. This summit was the spark. By the time Elon and X left the room, without apologizing, half the press corps had already descended on the hallway. Microphones were shoved forward. "Mr. Musk, will you be disciplining your son? Did your son speak for you, Mr. Musk? Does this mark a political shift?" Elon said nothing. He simply looked into the nearest camera and replied, "If people are more shocked by my son's words than the problems we came here to solve, then we're not paying attention to the right crisis." The clip aired in under 10 minutes. And while some media outlets were calling it disrespectful, an outrage, or an example of bad parenting, others were calling it something else entirely: courage. In classrooms across the country, students whispered, "Did you hear what Elon's kid said?" Teachers debated whether it was brave or bratty. Pundits screamed on live TV, demanding apologies. And yet, in the court of public opinion, the verdict was far from unanimous. But back inside the White House, a place that hadn't forgotten an insult since its foundation, there was already talk of a response. Trump, pacing in a private lounge, was furious, not just because he'd been embarrassed, but because it had been done by a kid, in front of the world, while Elon watched. He wanted a statement. Something powerful. Something that would make sure everyone knew the former president wasn't someone you talk down to, especially not someone with a name like a math equation. But what came out wasn't what anyone expected. Because while Trump plotted revenge, Musk was already going viral again, this time for something he never intended anyone to see. That night, an anonymous Reddit post surfaced, a video taken from X's perspective filmed on a hidden lapel cam he wore during the summit. It wasn't the outburst. It was what happened before: the subtle condescension, the backroom elitism, the off-camera smirks and dismissive digs. X had recorded it all. And now, people were watching it in horror. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just a teenager mouthing off. This was a whistleblower in a hoodie, exposing the thin veneer of civility in a room full of polished egos. And the world? It was listening. By sunrise the next day, the story had already eclipsed every headline, not just in the U.S., but globally. What started as a sharp-tongued moment in a political summit had metastasized into a full-blown cultural wildfire. And Musk, just 13 years old, was now, somehow, a symbol. But for what? That depended on who you asked. In some corners of the internet, he was being hailed as the voice of Gen Z, the kid who dared to say out loud what others were too afraid to whisper. His face, usually obscured or left out of media coverage altogether due to his age, was now plastered across every major outlet in stylized art pieces. They drew him with storm clouds behind him, with a halo, with fire in his eyes. They called him Musk the Maverick, the boy who burned the room, the next disruptor. But not everyone saw him as a hero. Fox News went nuclear. Unruly, entitled, raised without respect, barked a panel of ex-generals, tech skeptics, and former campaign staffers. Tucker Carlson came out of media retirement for a surprise segment, seething. This is what happens when billionaires treat their children like messiahs instead of teaching them humility. The White House released a statement, carefully crafted, but icy beneath its diplomacy. Former President Trump has always welcomed civil debate, but this kind of public outburst, especially from the child of a private citizen, crosses a line. Meanwhile, Elon remained silent. No tweets, no interviews, no jokes. Just a single, cryptic post on X.com, his new media platform. Sometimes disruption doesn't need permission. Nothing else. But the silence didn't last long. Because someone leaked the second video. It was darker. Not just metaphorically. Taken moments before the outburst, the footage showed Trump leaning across the table, whispering something to a White House aide, barely audible over the hum of the room. But the hidden mic on X's lapel caught it. Musk's kid, weird name. Probably weird brain too. Wouldn't surprise me. Apple doesn't fall far from the egomaniac. It was cold, casual, meant to land as an inside joke. But when the video dropped, first on Reddit, then TikTok, and eventually splashed across CNN, it became the final nail. The insult to X wasn't just personal. It was strategic. A former president mocking the mental capacity of a child with the world watching. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether X had gone too far. It was, had he not gone far enough? Back in Austin, the Musk compound was on lockdown. A dozen unmarked cars were parked around the perimeter, not because of threats, though there were a few of those, too, but because the media wouldn't stop circling. Drones. Reporters. Think pieces. Elon's assistant had to physically intercept two journalists trying to scale a nearby hillside with long lenses. Inside, X paced the halls. He wasn't scared, but he wasn't unaffected, either. His face, usually unreadable, now flickered with emotion he didn't quite know how to name. Somewhere between fury and confusion. Elon finally sat down with him in the observatory. Glass ceiling, telescopes, the quiet hum of AI assistants floating through the room like ghosts. You knew what you were doing, Elon said simply. Did you also know what it would cost? X didn't answer right away. He stared up at the stars. I didn't care, he said finally. He talked about people like they were disposable. Like you. Like me. I just said what nobody else had the guts to say. Elon studied his son. It's not about guts. It's about timing. Power. You taught me to question power. I didn't say you were wrong, Elon said. I'm saying now they'll come for you. And they did. By evening, a new expose dropped, sourced from a group calling themselves Tech Watchdogs United, a suspiciously well-funded, anonymously backed coalition that claimed to protect society from the unchecked influence of technocrats and their families. The report was a hit piece. Doctored emails, out-of-context quotes, and a slideshow of images attempting to paint X as a destabilizing influence on American youth. Even his school attendance was scrutinized. One segment alleged he had hacked a drone for fun at age 9. Another claimed he once called a science teacher intellectually dishonest. The attacks weren't aimed at Elon. They were aimed squarely at X. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal warfare. But what they hadn't anticipated was what happened next. An uprising. Thousands of teenagers across the country walked out of school the next morning, some holding signs that read, "Let X speak," others spray painting GTFOH across lockers and city buses. The phrase "go to hell" had somehow become a slogan. A rebellion. Not against Trump. Not even against politics. Against silence. Against the idea that kids should sit down and shut up while adults destroy the world with polished smiles and closed-door deals. The footage had sparked a fire, but what came next turned it into a full-blown inferno. Inside the Tesla command center, hidden beneath a solar farm just outside Austin, Elon convened a private war room. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't political. It was defensive. A hologram of the U.S. map floated in the air, pulsing red in every city where protests had broken out. Dozens of teenage walkouts had evolved into coordinated online actions. Drone footage showed students spray painting "X was right" on school roofs. Local authorities were overwhelmed. The story wasn't fading, it was multiplying. Around the table were names the public wouldn't recognize, but whose fingerprints had quietly shaped the digital age. A blockchain savant from Taipei, a quantum security analyst from Stockholm, and deep in the shadows of the feed, a former NSA operative known only as Snowkiss. These weren't just allies. They were counterpunchers. Elon stood before them, not as a CEO or a father, but as a man who had just watched the system pivot to erase his son. We underestimated them, he said. They didn't come after me. They came after my bloodline. The screens flickered, because that's when the dossier surfaced. It was buried within a Department of Cyberethics database, flagged as obsolete, locked behind layers of bureaucratic dead ends. But Snowkiss found it. An internal program titled Project Silence, Behavioral Risk Protocols for Technocratic Descendants. The document, dated 3 years earlier, outlined methods to surveil, classify, and if needed, discredit high-profile children born to major influencers in tech, crypto, and space development. XAEA-12 Musk was listed as primary anomaly. His profile, disruptive intellect, elevated digital influence, high risk for ideological contagion. Below it, handwritten in red ink, were the words, "Observe closely. Neutralize if necessary." Elon stared at the document in silence. He didn't speak for a full 60 seconds. When he did, it was a whisper. They'd been waiting for him to speak. and the second he had they attacked. But now, they had to deal with what came next. Because the leaked dossier didn't stay in the war room for long. X himself posted it. No caption, no hashtags. Just a cold image of the government's plan to muzzle him, with the title Project Silence front and center. The world erupted. Cable news anchors tried to spin it as a hoax. Politicians from both sides scrambled to distance themselves. But the document was authenticated by multiple independent analysts. And suddenly the phrase neutralize if necessary wasn't just chilling, it was criminal. The White House issued a rushed statement. The project was theoretical, never activated, and not approved beyond internal analysis. But no one bought it, especially not the kids now holding vigils outside capitals, waving signs that read, "We are all anomalies." Meanwhile, back in D.C., Trump's team was in full spin mode. Leaks from his circle revealed panic. One aide described him as furious that a kid hijacked the media cycle. Another claimed Trump wanted to turn this brat into a meme corpse before the weekend. His team began planting stories, accusations that X had been coached, that Elon was using his son as a pawn, that the entire exchange had been orchestrated for a political comeback. But the public wasn't buying it, especially after one final blow landed. Caroline Leavitt, the investigative journalist who had exposed judicial bribery in Musk's legal battle the year before, dropped a new report. It tied Project Silence to a private lobbying firm that had previously advised Trump's post-presidency foundation. The firm's name? Liberty Spire. And it got worse. Much worse. Leavitt traced Liberty Spire's funding to the Horizon Initiative, a think tank that had been quietly developing youth influence metrics for the Department of Education. The same think tank had held off-record meetings at Mar-a-Lago 2 months before the summit. One of their guest speakers? A shadowy figure only known by his encrypted handle, Foresight. That's when Elon Musk made his next move. He live-streamed from inside SpaceX headquarters. No intro music. No flashy effects. Just a single camera, a dark room, and his son standing next to him. "Elon Musk here," he began. "And this is my son. You've met him already." X nodded once. "We didn't plan this." But apparently the future got tired of waiting. Then Elon dropped a bomb. "We are releasing everything. All the files. All the correspondences. Every record from Project Silence and related contracts that touched my name, my companies, or my child. Because if they were willing to do this to him, they were willing to do it to all your kids. And we're not letting that happen again." Encrypted zip files were uploaded, distributed across decentralized nodes. Mirror links flooded the internet before government agencies could blink. And that's when the final shift happened. This wasn't about a hat anymore, or a comment, or even about Trump. This was about power, how it hides, how it watches, how it reacts when a child speaks with more courage than a room full of polished suits. They thought it would blow over. Like all viral scandals, it would rage and then recede, replaced by new drama, new outrage, another face on another screen. But this didn't vanish. It deepened. The story grew larger than politics, larger than legacy. It stopped being about what was said and became about who was finally listening. And then, without warning, X Musk disappeared. There was no announcement, no media blast. He simply vanished, offline, off radar, into silence. His social media profiles were scrubbed. No sightings followed. Not even Elon, whose every movement was tracked and analyzed, offered a clue. When asked, he offered only a tight-lipped assurance that his son was safe. But safe didn't satisfy anyone. Not when the world had crowned a boy a symbol. Rumors erupted immediately. Some said he was hidden deep in a SpaceX testing facility. Others whispered of a secure Pacific island owned by anonymous benefactors. There were even conspiracies that he had been pulled into a digital realm, training with AI systems in some undisclosed Tesla black site. None of them were true, but none were fully denied, either. 2 weeks passed. The noise only intensified. Then, one morning, everything stopped. Screens across the world, on phones, gas stations, airport terminals, even the stock tickers in Times Square, blinked to black. Static, then stillness. No logos. No sound. Just the sudden appearance of a single figure standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was X. He stood alone, silhouetted by the wind and water behind him. No branding. No flash. Only raw presence. Just a boy who had grown into something too large to be unseen. What followed was not a speech, not a statement, but a moment. A still, quiet defiance. It was not the firestorm people had expected. There were no slogans, no insults, no escalation. Instead, it was something more dangerous, truth without rage. While the world had been screaming, this child had been watching. observing the chaos that followed his words, absorbing the reactions of power scrambling to contain a voice it hadn't anticipated. Now, he had returned, not to strike back, but to rise above. The screen split. On one side, slow-motion footage from the summit, closed-door glances, smirks, security shifts. On the other, footage of the aftermath, teenagers walking out of classrooms, chalking his words across campus steps, holding signs scrawled with defiance and wonder. Some simply read his name. Others just said, listening. And then, the screen went dark once more. No closing message. Just a pause that felt heavier than 1,000 speeches. In the vacuum of silence that followed, the world shifted again. Trump, sensing the return of momentum, staged a live address. It was brash, bitter, overproduced, exactly what his advisors thought the public craved. But it landed hollow. He denounced Elon, mocked the boy, warned of the dangers of giving children a platform. But the audience didn't cheer. They watched, quietly, as if waiting to see if he truly understood what had changed. He didn't. And by then, it was already too late. Days later, Elon made his move. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was something else entirely generational. He announced he would temporarily step away from the front lines of his companies to launch a new initiative. Not a business. Not a product. A platform. The Sentinel Project was born. Designed as a decentralized, teen-run network, equal parts truth archive and storytelling engine, it would serve as a home for those who'd been silenced before they ever found their voice. There would be no algorithms, no monetization, no manipulation, only stories, only signal. It was scheduled to launch on X's 14th birthday. And then, on a late summer morning, long after the flash mobs and debates and network panels had exhausted themselves, a car pulled through the gates of the Musk property outside Austin. The boy returned, just as quietly as he had vanished. There were no cameras, no headlines. He walked past the security drones, past the press barricades far beyond the trees, past the unopened mail that piled at the edge of the lab's entrance. He entered without a word. But before slipping into the house, he taped a note to the lab door. For simple words. No name, no symbol, just the aftermath of a revolution carved in ink. Next time, I won't whisper. The wind carried it across the driveway. The sunlight lit it just long enough for a passerby to see. And in that moment, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The world had changed. And now, it was listening.